dating myself.
Does anybody feel like they need a microphone? Because I can make sure it's easy to, or do you think you guys are?
Tell you what, why don't you just give it to one of us, and if those who are at the back can't hear us, just look at us hard and I'll pass the microphone back.
We can hear you fine.
There's just a on-off.
Got it. The talking stick. The talking stick, that's where that comes from.
Okay. Welcome. I'm Pat Burdick, Special Collections Librarian here. You're in the Robinson Room, our main reading room, and this has been an awesome opportunity to collaborate with the Bridge and with our colleagues at USM. And we're hoping that this event is going to open up and continue some really great conversations at Colby and beyond. So we want to do that in two ways. First of all, we have people from the Videographers Guild who are videotaping this event. Thank you. And we will make that available online. And the second way of continuing the conversation is that we are going to have a reception out in the Wormser Room after the event. So please feel free to join us for refreshments and kind of start these conversations. So now I'd like to thank our moderator, Margaret McFadden, and introduce her. Margaret is the Christian A. Johnson Professor of Integrative Liberal Learning at Colby College. She teaches in the American Studies program and directs the Integrated Studies program. Her teaching and research focus on gender and sexuality in popular culture, and her most recent book is The L Word, published in 2014. Thank you.
So my task this evening is to introduce our panelists and to moderate what we hope will be a little conversation afterwards. So what I'll do is I'll introduce the panelists. They'll each speak about their relationship to this topic for about 3 to 5 minutes. And then we're going to invite you, those of you in the audience who might have some stories of your own that have to do with LGBT activism or involvement, to share a little bit of your story, the beginning of your story. We'll have a sign-up sheet if you're willing to tell a longer version of your story, in hopes that maybe we could start collecting some more on the streets. Learn a little bit more about what's going on that we don't know about. But before I introduce the panelists, Pat asked me to just say a few words about a lot of these posters that are around here and that are out front, which come from my personal collection, which constitutes a large brown plastic bag into which I've been sticking things over many years. And the reason that I saved all these things is that lots of them were produced by students in my classes or the Bridge when I was the Bridge faculty advisor. And I saved them because I thought all of this activity at Colby has happened. And if there's no documentation of it, no one will know it ever happened. Right? No one will know what the history here is unless we have some kind of tangible markers of it, except those of us who were involved. So I'm going to donate them to Special Collections. So we will begin to have a little bit of a presence in the archive. Yeah? Okay, so without further ado, our 5 panelists are all here to talk about archives and absences and presences in archives. And first tonight will be Jim Merrick. Jim is the Colbiana coordinator for Special Collections at Colby, and he oversees the college archives. A Colby alumnus, class of '75. He worked as a reference librarian at the Boston Public Library and as an archivist at the Stanley Museum in Kingfield, Maine, before returning to Colby in 2009. So Jim will speak first, and I'm going to introduce everyone, and then we'll talk. Our second panelist is, on my right, Steve Bull. Born and raised in the Kennebunkport area, Steve comes from good Maine stock, going back to the 1600s. Okay, put that in your pipe and smoke it. In 1970,
we got baited for being outsiders from New York.
Oh.
So I always talk about my lineage of potato farmers. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. In 1973, he co-founded the Wild Stein Club at the University of Maine, Orono, and the Maine Gay Task Force the following year. In April 1974, Steve chaired the first Maine Gay Symposium at the Orono campus after 6 months of controversy that polarized the state. You see a little bit of evidence about that. He currently chairs the advisory committee for the LGBT collection at the Sampson Center for Diversity in Maine at the University of Southern Maine. Our third speaker is Susie Bach, to the right of Steve, who's the coordinator of special collections and director of the Jean Byers Sampson Center for Diversity in Maine at the University of Southern Maine. She built the Sampson Center, developing its African American, Jewish, and LGBT collections from scratch. Mostly what she does now is use primary materials and archive learning with students. It's great that these materials exist. Our fourth panelist, lots of you know, down at the end, is Alan LePan Tilson, who's worked at Colby since 1979. He assumed his current position of Cotter Union Postmaster, he thinks around 1989. None of us can really remember. For many years, he was the advisor to the Bridge, and I'm going to editorialize here, Alan. For over decades, he's been an incredibly important advisor for students, supporters of students on campus. When I got here, Alan was one of the few people doing really important support work. So, he was also a founding member of the Maine Lesbian and Gay Political Alliance, and he personally established,
No, I was, wow. Wow.
That old, huh?
No. You have a place in my heart.
Yes, that's what some of you may know as Equality Maine, that organization.
Right.
So it lasted a long time. He personally established the first Maine Lesbian and Gay Political Alliance Scholarship for Maine high school students. He's a former deacon of Northern Lights Metropolitan Community Church of Augusta, Maine, and it was there that he was encouraged to establish his current passion, the 1001 Smiles Toy Drive, which lots of us know about. Over the last 20 years, they've collected over 20,000 toys for local children, and this effort's been recognized by President Obama. And if you want to be inspired, Alan has been partnered / married for 47 years. And our final panelist is Melissa Barry Lehman, who's a senior member of the Bridges Steering Committee. They are a music and biology double major and competes on the Woodsman's team. And I learned they have a really super duper blog about rats. Get many, many hits. Okay, so Jim, would you like to start us off?
All right. I would like to stress the importance of institutional archives when it comes to documenting diversity in all the communities that they serve. Much of our work is aimed at collecting and preserving and making accessible the sorts of things that are often marginalized and neglected by official histories. The more a group is underrepresented in the archival record, the more likely it is to be misrepresented further on down the road. We often like to say, don't let other people write your history for you, especially if they have next to nothing to go on. And we know that the first organized LGBT activism on Maine campuses began around 1973-74. But it took almost 15 years for anything to get into the Colby archives. The earliest thing that we have is a pink ribbon, an armband, which is actually on the table back there, and a note accompanying it suggesting that it be worn in solidarity with gay and lesbian students as part of Be Glad, which was the bisexual, gay, lesbian awareness days that took place in the 80s. These were first distributed to students in April of 1988, and we know this because we also have the Echo archive of Special Collections. And there we find a letter to the editor describing the Monday morning after these envelopes were distributed in student mailboxes, that the mailroom floor was covered with pink ribbons that had just been thrown away. One of them made it into Special Collections. But we still have a lot of empty spaces. They're not as empty as they were yesterday. Amazing amount of material that Margaret brought in. And we encourage and urge folks to continue to bring us stuff that documents your efforts and your time here at Colby. I should also note that a few years after the pink armband incident, the student organizers decided that they didn't want to do ribbons anymore. They decided to switch the ribbons out and do pins instead. The pin said, "I support gay rights." We don't actually have one of those pins. I wish we did. And the Echo promptly responded with an editorial, "Bring back the pink ribbons." insisted that rather than the students switch out these pins, that they should keep going with the traditions that they had begun, which was only a few years earlier. So things do change. We know that the class of 1988 had realized that their 25th anniversary would coincide with the 2013 bicentennial of Colby. So they put together a time capsule for us. Now, unfortunately, the time capsule that they worked on was finished before the pink ribbons came out, so there weren't any pink ribbons in their time capsule. But they did include in there an early brochure on AIDS from the health center in an envelope. So they were at least thinking of us 25 years down the road.
Steve?
I apologize for writing this, but there's a lot to try to get down in 2 minutes. In the aftermath of Stonewall, gay and lesbian student groups started popping up around the country. University administrations, fresh from dealing with anti-war protesters from the Vietnam era, now had to deal with this newly vocal minority which challenged the prevailing attitudes, institutions, and laws regarding human sexuality and gender roles. There were lawsuits in Arizona, Georgia, Kentucky, and New Hampshire over the rights of gays and lesbians to gain student group status at state-funded universities. There were 8 of us who gathered in co-lounge at the student union at the University of Maine Orono in September 1973 to start what would become the Wildstein Club. In October, we went before the Student Senate, and after a very contentious meeting that lasted until nearly midnight, we won provisional status by a razor-thin margin. In December, we announced our first public dance on campus. The Associated Press picked up the story. The common perception had been that what was then called gay liberation was largely an urban phenomenon, and who are these people in Orono, Maine? We were perceived as an oddity and thus worthy of press coverage. It's probably news to the current generation of LGBT activists in Maine that we were one of the battleground states nationally for a 6-month period. It was bad timing for the UMO administration, which had just announced a major capital fundraising drive and had sent out a mailing to all alumni with pledge forms to return. Well, they returned them. A couple of years ago, a researcher going through the holdings of Special Collections in Orono came across an administration file marked Wildstein. I got an excited call from Desiree up at Orono. And she says, Steve, you won't believe it, it's 500 pages long. This is over just a 6-month period, the administration side of things. And now that safely resides in our collection at USM. In that file are return pledge forms, often with foul language mixed with biblical references, vowing that the university system would not get, quote, 1 red cent while Wildstein was allowed to exist. And also at the same time, in response to the AP story, Benjamin Bubar of the Maine Christian Civic League had taken a full-page ad out in papers around the state when he heard of the dance on campus. He was joined by the appropriately named Reverend Gass and Buddy Franklin, and they had these mega churches in the Bangor area with their own radio shows, and they used their bully pulpits to warn of moral decay and vowing God's vengeance upon us. Their forces were augmented by 36 state legislators, both Democrats and Republicans, who threatened to withhold $1 million in funding to the university system. The lines were drawn, the battle engaged. And by the way, the dance was a great success. 40 people braved the publicity and attended, including 4 students from Colby, who then came back and started the bridge. So that's where the bridge came from originally. I wish I could find those 4 people. Like there's a symposium poster up there, which I'll speak about a little bit later. But on the program we have at USM, it's one of the workshops we had was partially led by a Colby student, but we didn't have names then. And back then, we couldn't really take photos at the symposium. We have some of people, we had to ask a workshop, is it okay to take a picture? And people often didn't use their names. In January 1974, students at UNH won a federal court decision for their right to organize and enjoy full rights to the student group. At the same time, we were pushing the envelope and published a press release announcing our intention of holding a statewide conference at Orono. We had boxed the university into a corner. The Board of Trustees met the next week, and without mentioning us by name, passed a motion reaffirming their position on free speech that had dated from earlier anti-war protests. A university vice president called me into his office, and we were given the go-ahead for the first Maine Gay Symposium, which was held at UMO in April 1974. Over 300 people were in attendance, including a who's who of national activists. In the early years, it was like a war. When the battle flared, troops came in from all directions. Most every leader on the East Coast made a trip or two to Maine during that time. Colby students attended the first symposium, and at least one was on one of the workshop panels. The first symposium marked the beginning of the statewide movement in Maine. There had been disparate groups around the state, from Hancock County Gays to Gay Support in Action in Bangor, groups in Brunswick and Portland, the type of thing where you met in someone's living room. The symposium brought us all together for the first time, and we were determined to maintain that momentum. We announced the creation of the Maine Gay Task Force in May 1974, successfully lobbied for a gay rights plank at the Maine State Democratic Convention that month, only the second such plank in the country. In August, we launched the Maine Gay Task Force newsletter. There's copies of that, and Mainly Gay, which succeeded it. And that became our collective organizer, both reporting news here in Maine and nationally, as well as announcing political actions we initiated around the state. The next year, we opened a public office in Portland and successfully lobbied to have homosexual acts removed from the Maine Penal Code. These laws had been on the books since the 1840s. Again, we were one of the first in the nation to do that. I've only given a thumbnail sketch of that early period, but hopefully have at least minimum piqued your interest or further research. We welcome you to visit us at USM. We have a full set of the original Maine Gay Task Force newsletters, and perusing them will give you a flavor of the times and might be surprising. Some tidbits from that. A gay marriage ordinance debated by the Washington, D.C. City Council in the summer of 1975. Our picketing of a bar and restaurant in Ogunquit with a large gay and lesbian clientele which would not allow same-sex dancing. Our fight on behalf of lesbian Carol Whitehead for custody of her child. Marching against racism in Boston during the busing crisis. Our picketing of what was called the Freedom Train, which toured the country prior to the bicentennial celebration in 1976. And we picketed it for its lack of representation of gays, blacks, women, the working class, and the poor. We had rotten eggs and veggies thrown at us. We were a feisty lot, and I'm proud of the work that we did. So that's some of my story. How will yours be written? Thanks.
Susie, you're on. Hi, my name's Susie. Have any of you ever not been able to get a job or housing because of what you look like or who you were? Anybody? Yeah? Yeah? You're older, you don't count. The reason I opened that way
Women
is...
in science.
What?
Women in science.
Women in science, yeah. The reason I opened that way, and I would ask you on the, over here to my right, your left, is a little exhibit called Charlie Howard, 25 years later. It's actually 30 years later now. Who knows who Charlie Howard was? Who knows who Matthew Shepard was? We had a few more hands go up. The reason you don't know who Charlie Howard was is because he was killed in 1984. He was murdered because he looked gay, in fact was gay. A bunch of young men attacked him and threw him off the bridge in Bangor, and he drowned. It is considered the spark that started the LGBT civil rights movement in Maine. The reason I asked how many of you weren't able to get a job or housing or something because of what you look like, that's what civil rights are all about. It's about saying that we all have certain rights that are undeniable. It doesn't matter what you look like, what your sex is, what your sexual orientation is, all humans have these rights. But having those rights is something we need to fight for generation after generation. And the reason I say all that is that's what makes things like special collections so basic to our society and to our civil rights. Because unless we preserve these histories of what's happened before, it'll happen again. And so when somebody gathers together a whole series of posters like this, it helps us remind us what happened, and it helps us analyze the past and look to the future. When I look at these posters over here, the first thing I see, I said I wasn't going to move around, so sorry, is I look at this poster, and the thing that goes through my eyes is somebody had money. Because that's a well-designed poster. So that was a graphic artist or somebody who had talent. Either they had the money to pay a graphic artist, or they had somebody involved with the organization who was willing to give their time to capture a mood. It's proud and that rainbow of colors and the symbol of a steeple that anybody in this area would know what that was for. So they had to have money and able to do that, which means there was a bunch of people who cared about that. This single poster tells me so much. It is material culture that carries the story of the history. It carries the history with it. The same way that in the 1990s in Maine, Annette Dragon took photographs to document, she was consciously trying to document the civil rights movement that was happening. And these two pictures capture that history. In this picture, we see a bunch of students captured between two forces. One is a policeman in uniform, and one is a head high school principal. And we learn from the caption that this is 1993. Condom crusaders continue at Deering High School in Portland. The image shows crusaders in conversation with a Portland police officer. Basically, they were holding out condoms because to push safe sex. But it obviously wasn't really a done thing because they've called the cops on them. And it looks pretty peaceful. I don't see any violence going on. But she sure doesn't look happy. And having these people grouped between this symbol of authority and this frowning face, that tells you something unusual was going on. And this wasn't an acceptable practice at that time, whatever they were fighting for, i.e. the distribution of condoms. The sign also tells the story. How many times have you seen a bunch of marchers go down the street carrying a sign that has the word fuck in big letters like that? I would look at this and I'd look at the number of people and I'd look at this street. This is a major street. There's a bunch of, this is the middle of a city. And they're carrying a sign that reads, "We're queer, don't fuck with us, rights now." The very words used and the way they're using them and on this sign tells me this is a bunch of people who are really mad about something. In fact, this happened right after the then governor of Maine,
McKernan,
thank you, who had promised to sign legislation ensuring gay rights, reneged. And the community was angry, and it's shown. This photograph is part of material culture. It captures that history. It carries the history with it. Special collections save material culture and save our history so that we can learn from it, so that we can use this photograph to analyze history and understand what happened, and maybe understand our society better, and hopefully move it forward in a positive way. Thank you. Alan?
I guess I'm next. Mine will be brief, I'm sure, but is more of a personal history with the bridge and the events of Colby. When I came in 1979, there was no bridge. There was a group of individuals, brave individuals, who would meet about once a month at the dining hall for dinner. The atmosphere was certain Greek organizations would have young men posted at the door and take the names of everyone entering the room. So the atmosphere wasn't the best on campus. Then there were at that point, no out faculty allies or administrators who were really there. I'm sure one-on-one you had support, but publicly there was none. So after a couple of instances of harassment, physical harassment, then President Potter jumped into the fray and through the board, and then the threat of what can I say, not retribution, but the threat of being chastised and penalized, the atmosphere began to change. Colby's early leader in same-sex benefits for administrators, which was rare, because at that point there was only one, and it wasn't even a college, it was a business in Portland. There were two young people who I hold as the gods for the bridge. They are Tom Haggerty, lovingly known as Faggerty Haggerty, and Katie Morrison, who at that point didn't care who knew they were gay. They flaunted it, and they were both well-respected, Katie with her religious organization affiliation, and Tom as a member of the swim team. They did not care, trust me. The bridge was formed and exploded with members and allies. I can remember a bridge meeting with over 100 people at it. I don't know what you get now, but 100 was a huge.
Not 100.
The biggest ally at that point was a gentleman, Father John Marquis. He would go to every bridge meeting. I remember one that he sat there, and it was an emotional, what can I say, moment for everyone, because he turned to the bridge and he said, if Christ was on earth today, he would be at this meeting. And so that reassurance, if you will, an emotional reassurance, just exploded the bridge even more. They began their work with voter registration. At one point, Colby ward that we're in was the highest voter registration in the city. There was some contention down at the polls. As Colby students went to the polls, people threatened them in the sense that they told them that their financial aid would be terminated because they were voting not in their own states, and which was wrong. It's not possible to take your financial aid away from you. In the 90s, the assault on equal rights just exploded with Colby students. Equal rights had been turned down by the governor. Jim brought up so many memories of what we were fighting for. I have to tell you that the night that Mr. McKernan turned us down, there were probably 400 or 500 people in Augusta marching, and of course the gay men could not be outdone, so we brought candelabras rather than candles. And we marched around. But anyways, and we got a lot of catcalls, but we did get a lot of support. And I have to give great credit to an organization called Outright. Because here we go, these young men and women came to that particular march and laid in the street, not letting any cars pass. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm 40 plus years old at that point. I wouldn't do that, but these kids did. And it did so much for the organization to change their reputation, because to that point they were considered hooligans. Over the years, we brought a great number of people to Colby to speak and to perform. I don't know if you're familiar with Leah Deliria. She's now on Orange is the New Black. She was here several times to visit and to perform. Others were, what can I say, Margaret Cho. We had her for an evening, which was a hilarious night. And then we've had Romanowski and Phillips, which you probably will never hear of because they were a whole, I believe, generation before you, but they performed here at Colby. And we're pleased to have Gene Robinson and especially Larry Kramer. He is the founder of Outright, and he wrote the play Normal Heart. One of my students from the Bridge and one of my employees directed it. So Larry was sitting there writing, and the young man went up to him and said, I don't mean to be rude, but why are you taking notes? He said, well, I'm giving the notes to the person who owns the rights to the movie. And he said, may I ask who that was? And he said, oh, Barbra Streisand. So John just exploded thinking, oh my God, my production is going to be reviewed by Barbra Streisand. I have another story about that. Someday I'll tell you one-on-one about.
At the reception, Alec.
John's parents took him out of school because I was accused of making him queer. Okay, and that was unfortunate, but that was the mood at that particular time. I don't think I can make anybody queer. Okay, my favorite person, it took me 3.5 years to get her here, was Judy Shepard. Matthew's mother. She brought a crowd in that I have never seen at Colby before or since. It was a very emotional evening, and as I say, it took me 3.5 years to get her here, but we got her. So thank you for your time.
Okay. So I haven't done as much as these people. So I think it's really important to acknowledge the efforts by past students who have really made the Bridge what it is, and they've really made campus in general safer for LGBTQ students today. Because of this past activism, I can feel safe knowing that I'm going to be able to walk home from this panel and go back to my dorm and not face any violence or harassment by anyone. And a lot of people before me couldn't say that. And also today the Bridge has grown from those 4 students back in the 70s to a mailing list of about 300 members.
Wow.
And I think that we don't get that many people at our meetings. And I think that is in part due to the long-term reputation the Bridge has had on this campus. And this year, our work in shaping the Bridge has really been divided into 2 efforts, which we consider internal and external. Internally, we're really trying to make the overall queer community at Colby more tight-knit and supportive of each other and more welcoming. And externally, we're trying to strengthen our relationship the Bridge has with other aspects of Colby, and that includes collaborating with other Pew clubs, a lot of work with SOBU this year, and working with the administration and academic departments and general outreach and education to the rest of the student body. I think that the major current issues we are trying to deal with on the Bridge this year, right now, involve the intersection of queer identities with race and ethnicity, and then also making the campus a better place for trans and genderqueer students. For example, the fact that the Bridge has really only catered to white, middle class, and cisgender queer students has been an issue at least as long as I have been attending Colby, which is longer than I should be. So queer students of color and international queer students have different experiences and needs from those of us who are white, and it's both in terms of their experiences as a queer person of color at Colby and how their queerness relates back to their lives at home. And I do believe that there are a lot of unresolved racial issues within the queer community at Colby that need to be addressed and that we really do need to work on, and it's very bad. And we also have been making a lot of strides to make Colby more welcoming for trans and genderqueer students. A lot of people on campus, both gay and straight, simply just don't know enough about transgender and genderqueer people to make Colby more welcoming for them in the first place, and it is our job as the leaders of the Bridge to fix that. And we've also been working on
Abby very much, has been working on, you're sitting right there in front of me, I'm going to say your name, creating more gender-neutral bathrooms across campus so that transgender and genderqueer students feel more
Sorry, that's
comfortable
really important.
in doing something just as basic as using a bathroom in the place where they live. And right now, I think that for me personally, it's very interesting to be a leader of the Bridge. Now that a lot of the outright violence against gay and lesbian students on campus has become less of an issue than it was, 30 years ago. There are students now that are saying that there isn't really a need for a club like the Bridge to exist anymore. However, I disagree with that, and I think now that we don't necessarily have to worry about whether a student is going to get attacked walking home, we're able to focus on more nuanced issues within the queer community and even Colby at large, and how to make just both of those communities a lot stronger.
Could I just add a comment? Rarely does anyone celebrate the fact that something related to our community disappears. But the fact, we used to have an organization on campus where it was called Allies, and you would have safe zones on campuses. So if you ever felt threatened, there were offices you could go to, other buildings you could go to. And that's no longer necessary. And so you're very, very lucky to be at this particular point in your gay life to feel so safe and comfortable on this campus. It's been a wonderful, wonderful transition. So I wish I was here 30 years ago.
I think we actually do still have those, but people don't really use them anymore or know about them because it's not really something that people have to worry about anymore. But they are there if you need them.
Well, so we have a few minutes. Are there people in the audience who have?
Or if there are people on the panel who have questions?
Oh, yes, that is true.
I would love to hear about the work on the transgender bathroom. I think that's a really important issue.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, right now I'm working with the physical plant department to change the signs. We're just finalizing the design right now, and then there'll be about 40 plus single occupancy restrooms that will be changed in about the next month once they order the signs and install them. So after that, most of the dorms in certain sections will have them, and then trans students can ask to be housed in certain areas without being concentrated into a specific dorm. And then they'll have access to a door that locks and then a toilet shower sink behind that. And looking to long-term, we're also looking at what to do with multi-stall bathrooms, because the goal is to have a gender-neutral restroom in each building. But currently, Maine plumbing code isn't written to allow for that. So we'll be looking at maybe how to do exemptions or how to work on them.
It's amazing.
Congratulations.
Stumble
Yes.
on it. Who knew that there was a name plumbing code that would be involved with something of this nature? Well,
No, but to have 40 in the next month or two, that's,
That's pretty impressive.
yeah, that's very impressive.
We already have two on the street. Yeah.
The problem is that they're not labeled in
As
gender
such,
neutral.
right,
They have the
exactly.
binary
So
on
they
the
need to
sign.
be labeled.
Yeah.
I just wanted to give a shout out to Julie McDonald, because she was the one who
Yeah.
started Project Ally, and I came on a year, well, I guess the first year that it was started, and then carried it on for a while until, as you said, it seemed to be the case that it was no longer needed. But it was interesting because she was modeling it after a national organization called Project Safe Zone, and wanted to bring it to Colby's campus, and was told by the administration, well, if we call it Project Safe Zone, that implies that there are unsafe places on campus. We wouldn't want to do that. So we called it Project Ally. And there were stickers. You could have a sticker that you put up outside your office, but you had to go through the workshop before you could get the sticker. And there were people who said, well, can I have a sticker for the door? And I said, sure, sign up for a workshop. But I had meetings in the Eustis boardroom and met with security, met with health center, all these different departments, as well as student government officials, campus leaders, for quite a period of time there in the 90s, in the early aughts. But it was, I think, a very poignant thing. We showed a film by GLSEN, and the head of GLSEN was one of the speakers who came to campus as part of the workshop training. In it, a young man tells a story about having been thrown out of his house by his mother with the help of a policeman who came to her aid and basically told the kid, no, you should leave, you know, you have no place to stay in this house. And afterwards I said to them, you have to realize that everyday kid on this campus either has had a similar experience or knows somebody who has. And so every time they see a badge, they're going to think about that story or that kind of story. And it may not be fair to you, but you have to know that this is what's in your minds and interact accordingly with them. So that was the kind of stuff. But Julia McDonald,
she was another one
huge props.
She didn't care.
She didn't care. She didn't care. She wound up working with, I think, an AIDS.
AIDS, yes, in Portland.
In Portland,
yeah,
was it? Yeah. But was involved in a lot of the state campaigns for various.
Laura?
I was going to say, during the break or refreshments, if anybody, I have a couple of very poignant, beautiful coming out stories that most of my students have. So I'll share them with you if anybody's interested.
So I may be misunderstanding, but my impression is that the Colby archives are not as rich, say, as the UND archives. And so I'm sort of, this question is for anyone who cares to answer it. But how would you suggest remedying that? I mean, is it through the collection of ephemera? Is it through oral histories? Is it some other way? And sort of what are the barriers to getting more into the archives?
I think the barriers is finding the material. Things disappear really quickly. You're very lucky here at Colby. You have a superb head of your special collections, Pat Burdick. Pat and I have known each other for a while and worked together. You have a special collections librarian who understands the importance of saving this stuff and of being a wonderful open person who is very welcoming the fact that this is taking place tonight in this special collections. She's making a very strong statement that this is important to her.
And I have a great staff.
And she, yeah. But the thing about material culture that always gets to me is how quickly it disappears. The fact that nobody knew who Charlie Howard was. And that was the spark, and that's within, I mean, the last couple of generations. Things disappear so quickly. Paper is so flimsy, and I mean, how many of you have every piece of paper you've ever touched in your life? Yeah, I don't either. Apparently me.
Margaret does.
But it does. It carries, these things carry that history. The signs for these first bathrooms that are going up. I would ask the facilitator, I gotta tell you, I would be down there talking to facilities, say, well, if you have an extra one, would you mind sending it to the archives?
This one broke, can we have that?
Oh dear, this one broke.
One of the jewels in my collection, not in my LGBT collection, but is we have a little sign, piece of paper, it's about this big. It's a handbill from 1853 or 1848. It's a sign that somebody commissioned a local newspaper in Missouri to print up that is for a runaway 19-year-old mulatto slave, a female, who's run away, and it's big letters, it's runaway slave, and they want this owner wants the slave back, and so is posting the sign. And what's amazing to me, it's on paper that's flimsier than your pad here. It's got a hole in the middle of it. And my conjecture is that hole is from where somebody nailed this up to a tree or a fence. And at some point in 1848 or 1853, whichever it was, somebody else took that sign down and held on to it. And it got put in somebody's bureau drawer. And this thing existed for over a century until it made it into the hands of a rare book dealer who then sold it for many, many hundreds of dollars to the collector who then gave it to us. But every time I look at that sign, it horrifies me to think, okay, yeah, slavery really was real because somebody paid money to print this sign up, to put up on a tree or a fence to get that slave back. And this little piece of paper survived all of these decades, survived over a century in order to make it here today to tell us, yeah, this really happened. So when you have something like the bridge or student groups or doing activity like making sure that there are transgender bathrooms on campus, unless you save some kind of record, those stories get lost so quickly. And without those stories, we can't know our history. We can't learn what the next steps should be.
It's kind of like a treasure hunt sometimes. You got to be lucky. I mean, I've literally gone into people's garages and gotten trash bags from a relative who was going to throw away all these organizational records of one of my cohorts from the 70s. And she did burn all his diaries, which was a tragedy because they had sexual content in them. But I'm hoping that, I mean, for instance, we followed up this alum of Colby that was here in 1975 who had a very bad experience at Colby, evidently. But he got, Jim got in touch with him through Facebook. And I was hoping an event like this, and it does that for us at USM, it shakes out people that come into the room and say, well, I know somebody who knows somebody, or I have something. And just the fact that Special Collections has done that, so it shows that they're embracing this effort. And, maybe not tonight, but if you have a series of events on things over the years, you might well find some of those early people. I found out just looking through the Echo online, before we were planning on this program, of this letter called The Facts of Life that was sent anonymously to the Echo because it was literally a week before the dance where the 4 people came up to Porno. So that's gotta be one of the people, because the person is gay, wrote this letter to the Echo, and then a week later we get 4 Colby students. I think there's a coincidence there. But to track down those 4, and then obviously when Alan came in '79, it had folded again. And I had some sense of that, but again, it's like student groups and the transitory nature of it. If you're there for 4 years, well, there's a subjective factor in history. The first 4 people graduate, have you developed a new group that's going to take it over? And evidently there was a gap there. But that shit happens. That's the way history is.
I think it's, to answer your question, it's the awareness, and it's come up a couple of times, the word allies. Almost every civil rights movement has worked off the backs of a previous one. When I first got to Maine and started building the LGBT collections, one of the first collections I went to pick up, the guy who gave me his material said, well, how much do you know about the, gays in Maine? And I said, well, basically nothing. And he said, well, let me give you the short history. And he basically said, basically the men were just screwing around, not doing anything, but the women, lesbians, they were organizing. And they were mostly doing it because they were working towards women's rights.
Yeah.
And he said, and if it wasn't for them, because they were the ones who, when AIDS hit, they were the ones who had already been organizing and had the skills. And they dropped their agendas of working for equal rights for women and came and put their efforts behind gay rights and behind, because of the AIDS crisis, raised the issue that there was a whole part of the community that wasn't being served medically. And they became our allies. And if it wasn't for the women, we wouldn't have been able to really launch the fight against AIDS and then what became the civil rights movement, the LGBT civil rights movement. And no, if you think about it, any minority, they're the low group on the totem pole, they're not the ruling majority. And so you need help and allies building bridges to other groups and fighting with other people is the way you get things done. Steve once told me an early story about the group at Orono. They took it very seriously. They would go out and they would help any group that was, you went down and picketed on a picket line for a union.
The state workers, yeah. And it was really, well, yeah, we had this concept that democratic rights are indivisible. You can't, be against immigrants coming into this country and it was always even problematic back then. But here we are, the university union workers at the university, you probably don't have union workers here, do you? It's a private institution. Anyway, they were in AFSCME, which was the American Federation of County, State, Local, Municipal Workers, or whatever. So they had a beef with the entire university system, so there was a huge rally in Augusta. We surrounded the State House. So, who's the only student group that goes and brings our own signs, Wildstein for campus workers, and all this stuff? And, you're talking about the workers on campus, and they were like keeping up us at arm's length. But what do you think the bus ride back was like compared to the bus ride down there? And for the next 2 years that I was at that campus workers would come up to me. They would say, remember who was there, who wasn't? And also like, oh, I have a niece. Would you have someone that could give her a call? Would you, like blah, 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 that sort of stuff. And that was just so important to us because when it mattered, we were there for them. And I tell you build that kind of course we always, we won our whole gay slate. I think that was the first in the country. We had a gay slate for Student Senate in '74. And we won, but we worked all the women's groups, the ACLU folks, all these other folks on campus, and we won because there were a lot of disgruntled people. I always kind of phrase it like, even though we were in a minority, we were against the current in general, but we also had wind in our sails. And it's a funny thing because it's not like we were a majority and commanded power. But we were the activists, we were the fighters, and some people didn't care and didn't get the votes out and everything, and we accomplished things just because we were so damn determined.
Jimmy, you probably can remember when the motorcycle group here in Maine wanted to defeat the helmet law. Who did they ask to join them in their fight with the gays? That was the strangest grouping I ever...
Was there a Maine Dykes group on Dykes group?
There
Was that back then? Was there a Maine Dykes on Dykes?
Yeah. So they asked us
I have to go to those meetings.
And I apologize, it was ACT UP is the name of the group that I was talking about. No.
There's also an outright, but active.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Can I tell two more quick Colby stories?
Yes, you can.
One, I don't remember how long ago it was, but I think it was probably mid-'80s. Anybody remember Anna Arkist?
Yes.
Okay. Anna Arkist, lesbian separatist, came to speak on campus, was invited to come and speak, and she did so on the condition that there would be no men in the audience, which produced an enormous amount of discussion on campus, as you might imagine, which was really wonderful. Talking about academic rights and, I've paid my money and so on, and what does this mean in separate space and so on. But as I went to her talk in Mary Lowe in the coffee house, there was this double row gauntlet of football players standing there watching every single woman as they walked through went into this talk. So it was an interesting experience, and she was an interesting woman. The other thing is a very much more personal story. My then partner came out to me as trans. This was in the mid-90s. And because we had been a couple and we were known on campus a lot at that point, it wasn't going to be just her transition, but it was going to be mine and our transition. And so I carefully went to my colleagues and friends and folks on campus and sat with them and said, basically, this is what's going to happen. And I don't know what they said when I wasn't in the room, but every single person was supportive. You know, maybe they didn't understand, but they still were supportive. And I just think that speaks volumes. And this was a year before Jenny Warren came out.
Yeah.
So I think when you're dealing with a one-on-one in that way, it's remarkable how supportive people can be.
Well, I think that the atmosphere is changed by just the conversation. Just have open conversation with people. This is how we won in marriage rights.
Exactly.
I mean, we had lost at the first meeting with our Maine Equality. I remember going to the meeting, and the then president said, how are we going to fight this? Some people wanted to go to the courts. She explained that the courts in Maine were not sympathetic to our cause, that we should literally take the next 2 years and do as many one-on-ones as we possibly can. And that's what they did. I mean, I can't tell you how many thousands of meetings went on between individuals, and minds changed. And in 12, we won.
Well, that seems a wonderfully positive note on which to end. May we thank our panelists. Shall we adjourn for a reception for refreshments? Thank you all for coming.